Okay, good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending where you are watching us from. This is Anna from Climate Tracker, and I have here with me Linda Schneider from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Yeah, so we are live in the climate negotiations. These are the corridors of the Bonn session. And we are really happy to have Linda here with us because she will be speaking of a very important topic, which is geoengineering. So thanks for watching us, even if you are seeing it now or later. We will just briefly introduce ourselves and explain a bit what are we doing here, and then we will just jump into the topic. So maybe you want to say something about yourself and the organization?
Okay, sure. Hi, everyone. So my name is Linda. I work with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. I'm based in Berlin, but the foundation has currently 29 international offices as well, and we're a political foundation associated with the German Green Party. And we mostly work on democracy, human rights, ecology issues, and gender equality. So pretty broad portfolio, and we work with a lot of partner organizations in lots of different countries. And personally, I work in international climate policy with a focus on issues around 1.5, geoengineering, negative emissions technologies, and also real solutions and more radical emission reduction pathways.
So that's exactly why we wanted her here, because it's one of the important topics that's being discussed this year, not only in Bonn, but later on in Katowice for the negotiations. So you know me, I'm Anna from Climate Tracker. You can see what we are doing in Bonn because we are kind of trying to explain us over social media. So like if you have any doubts, you will see our Instagram and Facebook and so on, trying to explain to the world what's these negotiations and what's happening. But if you have questions, you can always reach out. Before we start with the presentation from Linda, just remind you that you are seeing now a screen. This screen has next to it a section that says like comments. I will just write something there so you see it. Basically, you can send any questions at any point you want. And at the end of her presentation, we will just go back to that and try to answer them. So please, if you're watching us, just send any questions, even if it's so basic and you don't understand what something means. That's fine for us. Okay, so we are ready. Hold this 1 second. I'm gonna share the screen so she can start her presentation. Okay, so we are ready. That should be this. Not yet. Sorry, these things always take a while. How do I escape this? No. Screen sharing. Okay, now you see a loop, but this is the presentation. Great, you can start.
Okay, thanks. All right. So so we were going to focus this webinar on sort of the role that geoengineering plays in the UNFCCC and the IPCC, since we're here, so that makes sense. But we'll just start with sort of some a basic introduction of the topic, because you guys might not all be very familiar with the issue. So I'll give you a first definition, which is geoengineering is the intentional, large-scale manipulation of the Earth's soils, oceans, biosphere, and atmosphere to counteract climate change or some of its effects. And basically, if you look at the illustration on the screen, the thing is that at the heart of geoengineering is a very technical or mechanical, if you will, understanding of climate change and of the climate system. So what geoengineering sees basically is CO2 particles accumulating in the atmosphere and sunlight coming in. And those two components in combination, they lead to the greenhouse effect. So basically, geoengineering sees the greenhouse effect rather than sort of the much broader dynamics that lead to climate change, the much broader impacts and symptoms that has, and also the root causes. that that are much broader, obviously, and that have political and economic reasons, and not just technical reasons. So there's two basic categories of geoengineering technologies. One is called carbon dioxide removal, or CDR for short. And that is different, all sorts of different technologies that aim to draw CO2 from the atmosphere and bury it underground or in the oceans. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the individual technologies later on. The other category is called solar radiation management, or SRM for short, and that is a set of technologies that aims to block incoming sunlight. So sunlight coming from the sun, and aims to reflect a portion of that incoming sunlight back to space. So it doesn't even reach the Earth, and doesn't even heat up the atmosphere. Right. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of the proposed geoengineering technologies, just so you get an idea. I'm not going to go into all the details because we only have 60 minutes, and we'd be losing a lot of time. But just to give you a sense of what people have in mind. So this is basically showing the whole range of carbon dioxide removal technologies. One of those is BECCS, bioenergy coupled with carbon capture and storage. You might have heard of that because that figures very prominently in all the climate models. You have afforestation, if it's large scale tree plantations, but you also have sort of very technical approaches such as direct air capture, where you basically have large scale facilities that would suck CO2 from the atmosphere, and then, as you can also see on the screen, buried underground with the help of carbon capture and storage technologies. Yeah, there's also approaches that would spread out finely ground rocks on agricultural lands or forests. So that's also on land, and a couple of technologies that would target the oceans, such as ocean fertilization, where you dump large amounts of iron, for example, or other nutrients into the oceans that would then stimulate plankton growth, which would then, that's at least how the theory goes, sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, then die, sink to the ocean floor, and just remain there happily ever after, basically, until the end of time. So basically, as I've said before, carbon dioxide removal can take place on land and sort of on or in the oceans, or target terrestrial ecosystems or marine ecosystems, if you want to put it that way. So some of the problems and questions and concerns around carbon dioxide removal, and that's really just a selection, is, first of all, well, can this work at all? Because basically none of these technologies exist at this stage. Some are in pilot development phases. Some are really just basically hypothetical ideas, or exist, in academic papers, or people have done model runs. But none of these technologies, none of them are basically proven, and especially not proven at scale. Another really concerning factor is the resource consumption of those technologies, and that's energy, but also water, land, very much in the case of the terrestrial biomass-based carbon dioxide removal technologies. That's a really big problem, because you would need huge amounts of land to grow the biomass on for BECCS, for example, or for large-scale biochar as well. And that would have tremendous impacts on land rights on the ground. That would the land use would compete with other land uses, such as food production. You would get It's hugely devastating for biodiversity, for natural ecosystems, because in many cases you would have to turn natural ecosystems into basically monoculture tree plantations or crop plantations. Yeah, many of these technologies require large amounts of water, energy, and other resources as well. So that's really a big problem. And in many cases, it's also, especially if you look at the energy penalty, it's not even clear if those technologies could ever be able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, because they consume so much energy. And if that is not all renewable, it would just produce a whole lot of new emissions. And sort of on balance, it's very unclear if they would actually be able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Another aspect is the point of tipping points in the climate system, and that relates to the aspect of overshoot, really, because at least in the climate models, or in most of the climate models, what happens is that at some point, sort of towards mid-century, emissions reach zero, and then they go negative. That's what they call negative emissions, which is a very problematic concept. And basically, the idea is that in the second half of the century, we would remove, gigatons, hundreds of gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere with the help of those technologies. But since we would only be doing that in the second half of the century, there's a risk of overshooting, of getting a temperature overshoot before we've removed all that CO2 from the atmosphere. And that obviously is a big problem, because tipping points in the climate system can be reached sort of between those 1.5, 2 degrees, or just in this period of overshoot, and there's a risk of irreversible damages, basically, to ecosystems and communities. Furthermore, political risks and concerns of climate justice is really just to say that it is, from a climate justice perspective, it is very problematic that sort of the impacts of those technologies that are now, being promoted as the solution, or contributing to the solution to climate change, would basically affect the very same people and communities and ecosystems that are already much more vulnerable to climate change impact, and that haven't contributed much to the problem in the first place. And political risks also very much in terms of land rights that may very well be violated if large areas of land need to be dedicated to biomass production for CDR, or basically, since all of those technologies to be at a climate relevant scale would need essentially be global scale industries. And if we look at, for example, the human rights record of extractive industries, it's quite clear what would be in store if we establish those large scale international industries for carbon dioxide removal. So land rights violations, human rights violations, those are political risks as well. And finally, it's basically just the perfect excuse for polluting industries such as the fossil fuel industries and other polluting industries to at least try to prolong their business model as long as they can, because basically there's a technological fix to clean up the mess afterwards, and that very much serves to reproduce and strengthen and entrench the power structures of the current system, rather than embarking on that real transformation that we need to see for a climate just future. Okay, moving on to solar radiation management. That's in a way even more freaky to a lot of people. So there's a whole lot of technologies in this illustration. What people are really looking at is the injection of particles, of aerosols mostly, into the stratosphere. That's one, and the other, which is not even on this image, that is marine cloud brightening. So the brightening of clouds in marine areas at a really large scale. That's I would say the two solar radiation management technologies that are being looked at the most. There's other ideas such as, genetically engineering crops to make their leaves more reflective, but I think it's sort of sunk in that terrestrial measures would just not be effective enough, because you would need to brighten up sort of terrestrial surfaces in a way that's just not feasible after all. So shooting particles in the stratosphere for that to serve as a reflective filter around the Earth, or brightening clouds, that's sort of the most promising, or not promising perhaps, but the two technologies that people research a lot. Some of the problems and questions around solar radiation management, and again, that's really just a selection. There's a lot to say on this. In a way, even less than CDR, solar radiation management doesn't address the root causes of climate change. Although, I would at least find it very debatable to say that carbon dioxide removal addresses the root causes, but that's sort of a different discussion then. But in the case of solar radiation management, what those technologies do really is just to suppress certain symptoms, and that is basically the warming component. And sort of by reflecting a certain amount of incoming sunlight back to space, what really just happens is that you would try to artificially cool down the planet, or the climate, and that obviously raises huge and very profound and fundamental questions about who would then get to control the global thermostat, who's who would be in a position to set the global thermostat according to their own interests, and whose concerns and voices wouldn't be heard. So there's a whole lot of ethical and moral questions involved. The question of, because what we're getting from the models on solar radiation management, sort of on computer simulations, is that the impacts wouldn't be evenly distributed, but we would get regional winners and losers. So the question is, how do we an international consensus around solar radiation management deployment? How do we imagine that to emerge if it's clear that, or at least that's what the models say, that we would get regional winners and losers, and who would accept to be, the regional loser, obviously. So that's a very difficult problem for international, democratic decision making, and also democratic decision making within countries, because basically that would, in a way, render the world dependent on a technocratic elite to, over a very long time, and we're talking decades, centuries, or millennia, to control the global climate. And if we believe that this is even possible. Right, can this work at all, and can we ever test it? That's the problem with that, is that you can't really do small scale experiments. You can do them to investigate or do research on on the chemical properties, on physical properties, but to know what would actually happen, if it would actually work, you would have to move basically to full scale deployment to see what the impacts are, and then obviously that's an in a way irreversible experiment. yes, finally, precautionary principle technology assessment. That very much relates to the precautionary principle in international environmental law. That is a very important principle that should caution us to not, develop everything that we can perhaps, develop at a technological level, but also to assess um, the social, the environmental, ecological, all these implications that these large scale technologies would have. Yeah, so that's another very important point. Okay, why is geoengineering so dangerous? I've touched on a lot of these issues, but this is just to sort of reiterate that perhaps. One is just the scale, because for it to be climate significant, you would need deployment, at a mega scale, and that with that will come mega scale impacts. And if they're negative, those are mega scale negative impacts. The effects would also be transboundary by the very nature of those technologies, and they come with great uncertainties and risks. There's also great risks of basically disrupting still very poorly understood ecosystems that we all depend on, and that the rest of species on this planet depend on as well. As I said earlier, the impacts would be unevenly distributed and very inequitable. As I've said, specifically relating to carbon dioxide removal, but in a way it's also true for solar radiation management. Geoengineering constitutes a further grab on power, on land, on water and resources. So it's very unjust in on many levels. At least in the case of certain solar radiation management technologies, there is a risk of weaponization, and of those technologies being developed by military actors. That's one. And also of those technologies being used as a weapon, or to threaten other countries, threaten them with deployment or whatever. And that is a significant risk, because basically, especially powerful countries and countries with a powerful military would be in a position to carry out actual deployment, because you need huge fleets of aircrafts and so on, and a whole huge infrastructure to carry out that deployment over a long time. Another aspect relating sort of to international, peace and security is also conflicts over impacts that could emerge from unintended side effects, or just, foreseeable side effects even. Yeah, the emergence of new and large-scale industries, sort of new profits to be made from that, and as I said earlier, the perfect excuse for business as usual, because there's a technological fix to save the day. And finally, something that we also find very concerning and alarming in terms of democratic decision making is a certain framing of around a climate emergency and the inevitability of those technologies, which basically serves to override public concerns around these technologies and risks that are associated with them. And sort of what this leads to is basically to or what this serves to do is to uphold a failing or a failed status quo, and to prevent the real change that we need to see for a 1.5 world, or even a 2-degree world, that is not just any 1.5 world, but a climate just and an ecologically sound 1.5 world. Okay, moving on perhaps to, so those were the technologies and the risks associated with them, but there's also obviously a political context to this. So I'll talk a little bit about where this debate is headed right now, and then we can go deeper into some of those aspects. So one aspect is that negative emissions, this very interesting concept of negative emissions, which basically compensates, emissions from fossil emissions and industry emissions. This concept figures by now in almost all mainstream climate science and policy debates, such as, for example, the UNEP emissions gap of 2017. Solar radiation management, not quite, but it's getting closer to being considered in mainstream climate science and policies. So that's very concerning. The whole topic of geoengineering has gotten a lot more media attention since the Paris Agreement. That's very clearly traceable. There's also several outdoor experiments proposed, and these focus on solar radiation management technologies. And here in North America, so it's the US, but also Canada is the geographical hotspot in 2018. And I can show you, we've produced an interactive world map on geoengineering experiments and research projects that I'll show you later on. There's also, and this is perhaps sort of most relevant in the context that we're in right now, a certain tendency of normalizing geoengineering as a legitimate response to climate change that is currently underway in both the IPCC and to a lesser degree probably in the UNFCCC, and we can go into the details of that later on. But it's quite clear that geoengineering figures in both the special report on 1.5 that's coming out in October this year, and also probably even more so in the upcoming 6th assessment report that will be published in the early 2020s. And sort of in this space, in the UNFCCC space, there's several actors pushing for geoengineering to basically enter the UNFCCC, and it might do so as early as 2018 in the Talanoa Dialogue, in the Global Stocktake, in NDCs. But we can talk about that in more detail later on. Just to finish this off, I'm going to show you a few resources that we've produced. So one is the Geoengineering Monitor at the website that is on this slide here. That's a website that we're running with other civil society folks, together with the etc. group and Biofuel Watch. That's civil society news and background and geoengineering. We also have a landing page on our Böll page where you find briefings, analyses, background material. And below you see sort of the web link for the interactive map that I just mentioned. I have a picture of it on the next slide, and at the very bottom you see my email address in case you want to get in touch and have any further questions. The image that you see sort of on the right-hand side is the Big Bad Fix, which is our flagship report on geoengineering that we published last year together with the etc. group Biofuel Watch. So it's basically the longest and most extensive report on geoengineering that currently exists from a civil society perspective. Right, and this is an image of the map that we produced, where you can filter for certain categories, solar radiation management, and the other categories, and you can zoom into your respective countries or regions to see what's going on in your countries and regions. I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. And you see us now. Thanks for the presentation. I'm really shocked with the map, actually. I'm really shocked. I didn't know anything would happen that much even in Europe.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of things that are happening Germany or France, Spain, whatever? Just for I don't know, I'm overwhelmed.
Yeah. It's true. It does look very overwhelming. the thing is that it's not all experiments; it's also research projects. But that's also a bit of a blurry line, because in some cases, for example, China has a really, really big research program, and at this stage, they're not they're just sort of doing research and modeling and simulations, but they're not moving into technology development. But that also might change, right? And then again, for example, in Germany, we have a fairly big interdisciplinary research program and geoengineering, but that also looks at the ethics and sort of more implications, and is fairly, or has a lot of critical perspectives in there as well. So it's really an overview of everything that goes on in this field. But there's also a lot of sort of startups and individual for-profit companies, firms that have registered patents that try to make money from from developing carbon dioxide removal technologies, for example. So there's, for example, a first direct air capture facility in Switzerland.
Okay.
So that's.
And you mentioned it was a big year for the US. Why is that exactly, like what they are trying to do? Or
Yeah.
also Canada, you said, North America.
Right. Yeah. There's three important experiments that have been announced for 2018, or sort of this period of time. One is called ScopeX, which is by a group of researchers at Harvard University, and they're about to they've announced sort of to do first field tests for basically for that technology that aims to shoot particles into the atmosphere. So they would have a balloon and sort of go up with that and test and sort of analyze I think the chemical responses of sort of stratospheric chemistry to those particles. So it would not obviously have this huge climate effect, but it is from our perspective, those outdoor experiments, they're really a really critical political red line, because unless we've had this really, a much broader societal discussion about these technologies and whether we do want to develop them at all, we don't think outdoor experiments should go ahead and basically, because that always serves to establish legitimacy that normalizes the conversation around those technologies. Because you start with really small scale experiments, but then the scales get larger. And it's just a proof of principle basically, and so that's why we think stopping those experiments, those outdoor experiments, is really crucial. There's also a marine cloud brightening project in Monterey Bay in California, and an organization called Ice Aid, or Ice 911, who are testing in the Arctic, basically trying to cover up the Arctic to stop it from melting.
Yeah, I was actually also asking because maybe some of you wanted to write about it or something, and finding concrete examples, sometimes it's, if you don't know the topic, it's more complicated. So like the map is a good tool, and also like having a bit of explanation, like which groups are trying what, like maybe if you search in your country's only research, like just to see. I will just remind you, I mean, I have a couple of questions for her still, but you can send questions now. I haven't checked if there's any. So I'm just going to write now here so you see it while I ask one more question to Linda. So we are in the climate change negotiations. So we touched a bit on it, but how do you think this will relate? Like, do you see it happening now because we are opening a debate to increase ambition, or La Talanoa dialogue, or in COP? Like, where do you see the spaces where this is actually maybe becoming a debate?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Sort of what role geoengineering plays in the UNFCCC. So to begin with, geoengineering is not formally discussed under the UNFCCC. It's not a formal agenda item, and it hasn't been so far. But I do think that the UNFCCC is one of the spaces where there's a certain tendency of normalization of geoengineering, as a climate response. So, and obviously, as you said, that the whole sort of topic of 1.5 and the special report that comes out this year, this has intensified that debate, definitely. So what we're seeing right now, and what we've seen also at the last COP, for example, already is people put on side events, for example, that on geo. But I mean, from both critical side events, we did a couple that that try to raise awareness about the risks and impacts of geoengineering. So that's also there, obviously. But there's also basically events that promote
positive things,
well, yeah. So it was quite a lot of that, and it's probably going to be similar in Poland this year. So that's one of the spaces where the topic comes in, right? It's not part of the formal negotiations so far, but it comes in from the outside, and it sort of injects those ideas into the space, really.
Okay.
Also, we've seen a couple of submissions on geoengineering into the Telenor dialogue on the portal.
Okay.
There were also a few submissions pushing back against geoengineering. But yeah, that's another space where the topic has been raised, basically, and that ranged from sort of academic papers on certain technologies to an international governance initiative calling for the UNFCCC to pick up carbon dioxide removal and sort of address the governance aspect of that. Another sort of critical assessments of certain technologies. So it was a bit of everything, but it's interesting to see that this is sort of one of another space where this is basically being picked up. But I've checked had a look at the summary that I guess the Secretariat did of the submissions to the Telenor dialogue, and it wasn't mentioned. Geoengineering wasn't mentioned in that summary for now. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not sure if if we can, if that's if perhaps they would also be hesitant to mention it very prominently. Yeah. But yeah, I guess so far it's really still a bit on the margins, but it is, of course, also very much talked about in the corridors and inside events, and yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and that leads to my other question, which relates to the IPCC report that will come out. I know the final version is not yet available, but because it's about 1.5, maybe they relate it a lot to negative technologies like this. So how do you see this will play, or it will create like a bad narrative or something? Like, what do you think is the relationship between geoengineering and this report?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we're looking towards with some concern. I mean, as you said, the final draft hasn't even been prepared, and we can't really say much about the report because it's not finished yet. But from the leak that we had in January of the first of the first order draft of the summary for policymakers, it is clear that both carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management will be addressed in the report, and then we'll have to see how that plays out, and to what extent the risks are being taken into consideration, and sort of what conclusions they draw from that as well. Although I mean, from what I saw in the media, how the media picked up this leak into with regard to the aspect of solar radiation management, was really that they basically picked up the IPCC saying this is not going to be feasible institutionally, from a perspective of democracy and governance. So I guess it also very much depends on how sort of what narrative establishes itself in the aftermath of the report.
The political summary,
right,
summary for policymakers
yeah,
and all this. Yeah, exactly.
And the other thing is that obviously, since the IPCC doesn't produce their own model runs, all they can do is rely on model runs on scenarios that are out there in the literature, and pretty much all of them rely on large scale negative emissions. So in a way, it's clear that will figure in the report as well, because there's in a way not much they can do about it. Although at the same time, and that's a very I think that's very encouraging to see, that a lot of people have put quite some work into developing and exploring and developing alternative pathways towards 1.5 that don't rely on overshoot and negative emissions, and that's very encouraging, and it shows that those models have severe limitations. They're basically black boxes anyway in terms of the socioeconomic factors and inputs that are fed into those models, but it shows that there's a lot of mitigation options that are not considered in mainstream climate science and climate policy, that could, if they were to be considered, that could drastically reduce or even eliminate entirely the need for negative emissions. And then on top of that, we're seeing a lot more work emerging around what people have called natural climate solutions. So ecosystem restoration, mostly relating to forests, but also other natural ecosystems that have been lost, have been degraded over the past decades and centuries. I mean, we've a recent study, I think, found that we've lost half of the world's vegetation.
Wow.
And that obviously is a huge carbon debt that we have, that we've all the carbon that we've lost to the atmosphere, and that can be sequestered and taken up by natural ecosystems in a potentially very sustainable and socially compatible way, unlike many of the technological approaches to carbon dioxide removal. So that's very promising as well. And perhaps that is also, in a way, the answer to the question that is the title of this webinar.
Yeah.
Do we need geoengineering to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees? And I would say clearly, no, we don't need geoengineering to reach that goal, because there's plenty of options, to much more radically reduce emissions, and then also sequester and draw CO2 from the atmosphere in a socially and ecologically sustainable and just way. And at the same time, in a way, the question is phrased and framed in a very, in a way, irritating and perverted way, because it presupposes that geoengineering was able to get us to that temperature goal, and that is far from clear. That is far from clear, because as I said, none of these technologies are really being established as approaches that could actually do that, and that could actually work. Be it because it's just we only have computer models and we're just not sure if that's ever going to work, or because they produce so much emissions along the whole cycle that are not even effectively drawing any CO2 from the atmosphere, or in cases where they perhaps do that, they come with devastating effects for ecosystems and communities, and would cause, for example, tremendous biodiversity loss, and thereby exacerbate other crises that we have on this planet as well. Not just biodiversity loss, but also land degradation, poverty, food insecurity, marginalization, violation of human rights. All of that can't really be the solution, our solution to climate change, if we're just making matters so much worse in all other respects.
Yeah. So We were discussing before starting the webinar about actually this question, so I'm glad we got back to that. And we were seeing that many times media portrays it in a way that it's like, oh yes, but no, but they still include the possibility of actually this happening, which could be a bit like when they include climate deniers or something in the reports. But yes, it's a very interesting conversation to have between the reporting or journalism community, like, are we reporting this correctly? Is it fair if it's not proven that it will work? Up to you guys. But let me see if we have any questions. I don't think so. Nope. Okay. Maybe I don't know if you have any like last points to ask. If not, I would ask you to answer another question from me.
Yeah, I mean, if you have another one, that's
Oh, because I really like the idea of natural climate solutions, and I know that there's so many reports coming out with that. So if you can add anything else to that, like any projects that are being tried or any reports that are saying it would work, or just examples so people understand what are we talking about when we talk about natural climate solutions.
Okay, yeah. There's actually quite a few organizations and people and academics, I guess, that look into these issues more in depth right now, and I mean, it's mostly about the sort of careful and ecologic restoration of ecosystems, and mostly forests. That's really what we're mostly talking about, and that according to various studies and estimations has a huge potential. A potential ranging between 300 to 400, perhaps more, gigatons of CO2. So that's a large part of what the models assume we need in terms of negative emissions. What we need to be careful about is that obviously CO2 taken up by natural ecosystems is not as permanent as fossil and industry emissions in the atmosphere. So it would be very and obviously, a natural ecosystem, it's not that it's unstable per se, but there is a certain risk that a forest would be cut down. Climate change impacts throughout the century. I guess we can't really be sure. That some ecosystems don't collapse or whatever. So there is a great potential, but we should be very clear that this must not lead to, decreasing ambition in terms of mitigation. And that is basically what we've already seen with those negative emissions in the models, because because that basically changes the pathway. If you have the means to produce so-called negative emissions in the second half of the century, you're fine just doing less here and now, and that's the problem. So yeah, that's that's one of the risks that I would see. Like, not the solutions as such, but the way this could be used and abused for, like, politically. So I guess it must be very clear that we cannot be counting CO2 uptake in natural ecosystems towards the same targets, compared to other sectors. So it would be very important. But yeah, it's very fascinating. It's very promising, and also especially because it's quite clear that the best way of managing forests and other ecosystems in a sustainable way is to protect land tenure rights, to protect the rights of local communities, of indigenous peoples, and to make sure those lands don't get privatized, for example, to big companies that then plant monoculture tree plantations, but rather that sort of local communities have always, taken care of those ecosystems and have maintained them in a very, biodiverse and resilient way. So that's really the way the way forward, and that's very promising.
Yeah, and very nice. And that made me think that if geoengineering somehow delays mitigation or like makes the conversation more like, oh, we will see in the future, we don't need to hurry up that much. That's something actually very relevant for these negotiations as well. The same we were saying just now with the natural climate solutions. So something to take into account. I will just briefly check, but I think we don't have any more questions. But she has shared her email on the presentation, and you can always even email us and we will put you in touch with her if you have like any further questions or if you wrote an article and you want to share it with us. But thanks so much for watching, and Linda for being here.
Thanks
that was very nice. We will share this broadly, and this is recorded now, so you can also use it later on. So if you're watching us later, hi as well. And yeah, see you from the climate negotiations. We will keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.